All right, let's go ahead and get started. Without further ado, Senator McClellan and Delegate Price, thank you so much for being with us today. Thrilled to have you. Vote Local Day is about providing information and providing tools, but it is also about sharing stories of progress in our communities and at the local level. And I personally cannot think of a better example of progress than the conversation that we are about to have. Thanks to the work of Senator McClellan and Delegate Price, along with community organizations in Virginia, like New Virginia Majority, Virginia is leading the way in voting rights. It is leading the way and making it easier for Virginians to have their voices heard. It is an honor and a privilege and a great joy to say that loudly and boldly. Senator McClellan and Delegate Price, I'm going to throw this to you and let you introduce yourselves.
Well, I guess I'll go first. I am, hi everybody, I'm Senator Jennifer McClellan. Forgive me if my video looks a little fuzzy. I'm having technical difficulties like everyone, but it is a pleasure to be here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is not only voting rights, but how we are in Virginia leading the way once again on expanding access to the vote. So pleasure to be here with my partner in good trouble, Delegate Price.
Thank you, Senator McClellan. I'm Delegate Price. I represent the 95th House District in Virginia, which is based where I was born and raised in Newport News, Virginia. Before the shift in the Virginia General Assembly, I was the Vice Chair of the Privileges and Elections Committee, and I was the Chair of the Voting Rights Subcommittee in the House. I also serve as Director of the Virginia Black Leadership Organizing Collaborative. And like the Senator said, I'm just really glad to be here to talk about what we're doing in Virginia.
Amazing. Senator McClellan, let's start with you. Can you briefly talk a little bit about the history of Virginia and voting in Virginia, the significance of this being the first state in the South with its very own Voting Rights Act?
Happy to. First of all, let me give you all a sneak preview. You will hear or read, hopefully, an article all about this coming out in March, and I won't geek into as much as the article will, but I'm very steeped in this history as we speak. You know, Virginia is known as the birthplace of American democracy. We have the oldest continuous legislature in the Western Hemisphere. Voting began at Jamestown when the original Virginia company got off the ship. They had instructions on how to elect someone to sort of be in charge. Voter suppression started at that first vote when the Captain John Smith wasn't very popular, so he wasn't even allowed to vote in that first vote. And so I think, and you fast forward in 1619 when the House of Burgess first voted, it was only white land-owning men at the settlement of Jamestown, you know, who could vote in that first election. And yet we are also the birthplace of the idea of a government by, of, and for all the people. After Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence that applied, you know, said all men are created equal, but didn't mean all. And then James Madison, known as the architect of the Constitution, came with the Virginia Plan to create this government that we have today. He didn't mean for everybody. And our struggle really has been, how do we make the ideas embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that says we the people apply to all the people? Unfortunately, most of expansion of voting rights in Virginia and throughout the South happened by force after the Civil War, through the Reconstruction process under martial law, with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And we had a robust democracy for Black men, and yet women still had to fight for the right to vote. And needless to say, the story up until 2020 really was the federal government pushing through the Federal Voting Rights Act and other laws to expand access to the vote. Virginia and other southern states resisting that. And then we flipped the script. When the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby versus Holder, many other states rushed to restrict access to the vote. But because elections matter, and we had a pro-democracy, pro-voting rights majority here in Virginia, Delegate Price and I and our colleagues were able to expand access to the vote. And so I think having Virginia, birthplace of American democracy, but also the birthplace of massive resistance, to be the first state to say, we're not going to wait on the feds to force us to do it. We are going to be a bastion for voting rights is really poetic justice.
Yeah, you said it. I'm not even going to comment on that because you said it. Poetic justice is the perfect way to say it. If I have my stats correctly, 2016, which is not that long ago, Virginia was ranked the second hardest state in the country to vote. In 2021, Virginia was ranked the 12th easiest state to vote. And just last year, 2021, you are now ranked the 11th easiest state in the country to vote. I mean, that is like, I literally have chills right now just saying that. It's unbelievable in what, you know, it feels like a long time, but in such a short amount of time in history to make that progress is remarkable. Delegate Price, how did this happen?
Well, all I can say is it's been quite a ride. I tapped in 2016, and since I've been in many years before I started, even my uncle was in the Virginia House when I was born. So this has been a multi-generational fight, like the Senator said, Senator McClellan said, but even more recently, since 2016, year after year after year, pro-democracy bills would be killed at 7:30 a.m. in a random room in the Capitol. It wasn't live streamed, and it was by voice vote. So that's another thing that has happened within that that time frame. But like when the senator said the composition of the General Assembly changed, so we had a pro-democracy majority in both houses, and the governor that was also pro-democracy. And so that's kind of when we made voting rights our top priority, because we knew without a representative government, all of the other things that we wanted to get done would be at risk. So the key was, I think, that we listened to voters and what they felt like they needed to have better access, but also to be protected. So I do want to list out some of the things so you understand how different Virginia is now in these elections that we're going into right now, because early voting started. But we got rid of the excuse that was mandatory for early voting. We expanded the types of voter ID that could be used instead of just photo ID. We extended early voting to 45 days. So we literally are in our early voting period for this election. We allowed voters to apply for a permanent absentee ballot. So let's say like my grandma, when she was alive, she needed an absentee ballot every year. She didn't have to apply for one at each election anymore. It was permanent. We enhanced curbside voting for those with physical disabilities. We made Election Day a state holiday. We allowed for Sunday voting. Our same day voter registration will start this in a couple of days. And we had drop boxes during the pandemic. And then also during the earlier parts of the pandemic, we paid the postage for those that were returning absentee ballots so that even a stamp wouldn't get in the way of them being able to exercise their right. We also moved local elections to November for increased engagement and turnout. This is the first November for that. We allowed for 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register. And then the two bills, of course, that I'm very proud to have worked with the senator on, we made racial, partisan, and prison gerrymandering illegal, and we established the Voting Rights Act of Virginia. So, okay, I'm sure some people are like, wait, we've had some of that for forever. And I just want to remind you, we were 49th out of the entire country. And I just want to leave that whether it was Virginia being 49th or Virginia being 11th, either way, it's because of intentionality. You're going to either intentionally block access or intentionally open it. And I just think that we kind of serve as, it can go either way, but I'm glad we're in the pro-democracy majority, or were, in order to get that done.
I was trying to take notes on all the things. I was like, I can't write that fast. It's unbelievable what you were able to do. And, I think these things don't happen overnight, right? And they don't happen in a silo. And I think that a lot of people think, have this perception that legislators just work kind of, in their offices together. But you talked about, collaboration and listening to voters. And unfortunately, Tram Nguyen can't be with us. She's the co-director of New Virginia Majority, who we love. But I did want to acknowledge Tram and the community partners in Virginia, because it is about collaboration and it is about working together and listening and really being, in cahoots together to get this done. And that's how it happened. Delegate Price, do you want to just talk a little bit about what that was like, working, obviously you talked about listening to voters, but community partners and how that all kind of came together?
Yeah, so I'm an organizer first. I was an organizer that happened to get elected. So I kind of just grew up knowing the importance of anyone in leadership really listening to the people that they're serving. Well, sometimes you can't get to every voter. So working with organizations that represent the voices of voters is really, really helpful. And I think that's what we were doing. And just to put it very plainly, our pro-democracy journey did not start in 2020. It started years and years ago when those community organizations, the advocates and activists and actual voters, really made it their priority to fight for their right. And so I think, even some of the partners that work on environmental rights or women's rights that aren't directly with voting, they made it a priority as well. And so whether folks were knocking doors in the field to increase voter turnout, or getting folks to testify in our committee hearings, they were building the groundwork and the pressure that we needed to finally move the needle. And we just couldn't do it without our community partners. And if we take, for example, the Voting Rights Act of Virginia, while the senator is a lawyer, I am not. So it was important for me to do a lot of research on what was happening in Virginia, what was happening across the country, and again, what voters wanted to see in access to the ballot. So a group of all women got around the table, and we worked with Tram Nguyen of New Virginia Majority, who is amazing. We worked with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Their voting rights team is led by Marcia Johnson Blanco. And then we also worked with a team from the Advancement Project, and that specific team was led by Leah Aiden. So these amazing women had their finger on the pulse of the nation and voting rights, and we brought some of our historical knowledge for Virginia. And we just wanted to make sure, the senator and I wanted to make sure that we weren't just doing a bill with good intentions, but with maximum impact and a solid piece of legislation. And so then after the bill was written, the lawyers stayed by our side so that we could protect the bill from false attacks. We even got some of those organizations to put the voting rights bill on their legislative scorecard. So, the legislators knew people were watching how they were going to vote on it. And I just know if it had not been for our collaboration, we would not have had the political environment where pro-democracy bills could start being passed, but also we wouldn't have gotten it all the way through the legislature in the way that we did.
It's incredible. I keep hearing these two things over and over. One is progress, right? And collaboration comes from progress. And the other thing I keep hearing is this idea of proactive and reactive, right? There's a lot that's happening with voting rights, especially, but all human rights right now, that's very reactive to what's happening. But what is so interesting for me is this: you didn't just wait and say, okay, now we have to react. You said, all right, we got this moment. How do we intentionally, that intentionality you were talking about, line up with our community partners, listen to our voters, and pass proactive measures so that we aren't just reacting and kind of always on the back end. And I think, that is so important, especially now, which this next question, I'm going to start with you, Senator McClellan, is, for folks that aren't in Virginia and in our other states that are seeing this onslaught of harmful restrictive laws, where do we tap in, not just on the back end, kind of on the defense, but playing offense in the proactive way?
So before I answer that, I want to add another word to the list you just gave, and that's persistence. Because one of my favorite quotes is John Lewis. Democracy is not a state; it's an action that requires every generation to do its part. And Delegate Price and I both have our own family histories that show the struggle of how hard it was to be able to vote, whether it was literacy tests or poll taxes or whatever. So for us, it's personal, but we also deeply understand that you can't get discouraged when obstacles are put in your way, because just like expanding the right to vote was intentional, as Delegate Price said, restricting the right to vote was intentional. And so that's the first step, is just recognize this is an ongoing fight. And even when you have a victory, you cannot sit back and say, okay, I'm done. You have to recognize I've got to fight to protect and expand on that progress. And when you understand that going into the fight, it's a lot easier to keep going rather than get discouraged. That's the first step. Second, make sure you understand what the obstacles are in your own state to access to vote. They may look on their face to be reasonable, but in actuality, they may not be. So everyone says, well, what's so bad about voter ID? Well, there are lots of steps and obstacles and sometimes costs that people have to jump over to get an ID. And when you look at it, it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. A lot of times it's the multiple effect of many different restrictions. So understand in your communities, what is it that is keeping people from voting, and then go tackle that. And make sure that you are understanding why those restrictions were put in place to begin with. So I think those are sort of my thoughts.
Delegate Price, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yeah, in plainer terms too, because I think Jen and I are great compliments to each other. I was always told, stay ready so you don't have to get ready. And one day, hopefully your state, every state, I'm praying, will have the opportunity to pass pro-democracy legislation. And while we're still pushing for federal legislation, we can't wait. And so I would just add that 3 years ago, we looked like Georgia, Florida, Texas, but it was that work that we put in, such when the elections happened and it was our time, we didn't have to scramble to get ready. We were ready. And the pro-democracy legislation, the pro-human rights bills, we had been, even when we knew they had no chance in heck of passing, we had been putting them in, perfecting them, getting feedback, looking out for unintended consequences. So we were doing that work, on both sides the whole time. But I think that you have to be bold and out loud with your defense while quietly getting your offense together as well.
I love that. I love that. We are running a little close on time here. I want to give folks an opportunity to ask any questions. I did receive one in the chat that I want to go ahead and ask you. If anyone's on and wants to ask questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat and we'll get them answered. Either of you can answer this. What is the future? What does future progress look like for voting rights in Virginia?
Well, we're still 11. Our goal is to get to number 1. So I think, again, there are still barriers in place. Hopefully same-day registration will help with that, because I don't think that was in effect when they came out. But it's just going through, and again, Delegate Price talked about it, talking to our voters to say, what is the barrier in your way? We may theoretically know some of them, but we may not know all of them. And so I think it's stay engaged and stay vigilant and keep an eye on, are the laws being implemented the way we want? It's not just about how does a bill become law and then you're done. It's all of the voter registrars in all 130 some counties that we have. Our state board of elections, are they implementing these laws the way we want them to, in a way that makes it easier to vote? Or are they still dragging their feet and putting barriers in place? We've got some issues right now with voter registrations that are backlogged. We can't quite figure out why, but for some reason, our board of elections and our DMV didn't process a whole lot of registrations as quickly as they should have. So it's little things like that are not necessarily legal issues, but implementation issues that we've got to stay on top of.
Yeah, I would just add, make sure y'all elect an attorney general that's willing to stand up and say that election results are real and fight for, the things that, like in our bill, the Voting Rights Act of Virginia, the attorney general has been empowered to do a lot to protect voters, but you may end up with an attorney general that instead tries to push the big lie. So I think, wherever in the system, in either of the three branches, it is really important that you have pro-democracy people there.
And secretaries of state.
Yeah, which we've got a panel on clerks and secretary of state at 12:30. So tune in if you're watching now. One question, do you anticipate any pushback from the courts either in Virginia or in the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. We've seen that that's the playbook.
Yeah.
And one thing, Jen is a student of history, and so am I. There's nothing new under the sun. They've already tried to do what they're going to continue to try to do. And so that's why, again, it was really important for us to work with that team of lawyers to make sure at least, the Voting Rights Act of Virginia would stand up. We can't predict or control what the Supreme Court will do. But I do think that this just shows why federal legislation is so important and why everybody has to vote in every single election.
Yeah. I'm gonna leave it with one action step. What is one action step everyone can leave with to protect the right to vote and improve access in their own state? Besides voting, because voting is required.
That's a given, right? Well, I will say from my experience that you do not have to recreate the wheel. Tap in with one of the organizations that's already been doing the work. There's New Georgia Project, New Florida Majority, just like we have New Virginia Majority. They're all over the country, and they're waiting for you to tap in. So I think with all of the people doing our own part, the lift will be even easier.
And I would add, support the people in the organizations that are doing the work. There are a lot of people that talk about it, but they don't always do the work and do the action required. So make sure that you are uplifting the people in the organizations that are doing the work. And like Sia said, help them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Senator McClellan and Delegate Price. This was, I feel, a conversation we could probably have for days, if not, if not months at this point. I really appreciate your time today and sharing your insight with us, and equally important for your steadfast work in Virginia, and also being the model in the blueprint and the inspiration for those of us that unfortunately don't have the privilege of living in Virginia at this point. You are a inspiration to all of us, and thank you for all that you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thank you
for having us.